Hello and welcome back to this part 3 of building our Pokemon Chrome extension. At this point, you should be following along with the other videos and you should have completed our HTML as well as our CSS. So your project should now look something like this. Okay, so we have a basic Pokemon card, but at this point we are not filling in any dynamic information. We just have all hard-coded data. And today's video, we're going to actually work through connecting an API, particularly the Poke API, to our project so that we can dynamically fetch data every time that we open the app, just like this one. This is the final product that we're going for. So every time that we open it, we get a new Pokemon or an error, which you just saw for a second there. So the first thing that I want to do is start to talk about where we're headed in today's video. So the first thing is, if you have not used an API before, we need to get a basic understanding of how RESTful APIs work, as well as the fetch API, which is a built-in function with JavaScript to actually call on these APIs for some data. So let's briefly talk about what an API is. So API stands for Application Program Interface. And it's a way that your applications, your programs, or your apps can connect to some data source, particularly in this case, the Poke API, which is feeding us Pokemon. Okay. In any other application, you're going to connect it to your backend or some other API service where you're collecting data or using it to manage some data or do some functions, something like that. There's a lot you can do with APIs, and we're going to use basically the simplest form of an API today. We're going to use a RESTful API, which is a Poke API, and we're going to do a GET request on that. So I just want to briefly review how to actually do a request using the Fetch API. So this is directly from the MDN web docs. I'm just going to read some of this so that you can see what we're going to be doing today. So the Fetch API provides a JavaScript interface for making HTTP requests and processing their responses. Okay. So we're going to be making requests and then processing what we get in response. With the Fetch API, you can make a request by calling fetch with parentheses, which is available as a global function in both window and worker contexts. You pass it a request object or a string containing the URL to fetch, along with optional arguments to configure that request. The fetch function returns a promise, which is fulfilled with a response object representing the server's response. You can then check the request status and extract the body of the response in various forms, including text and JSON, by calling the appropriate method on the response. Here is a minimal function that uses fetch to retrieve some JSON data from a server. So we're going to basically build something similar to this today. So let's take a look at this function. So first of all, it's an asynchronous function. We can tell that by the async keyword here. And what that means is that there's going to be some delay in this function. So we are using promises, and we have to wait for those promises before proceeding to the next steps in our JavaScript. And we'll get into how that works a little bit later. But basically all you need to know is that when you have an asynchronous function, it means that we can await something, which you see here, this keyword await, which means we're going to wait until this promise that's returned from our fetch request is resolved before going to the next line. So it's going to wait to actually get the promise resolved before going to this if statement here. Okay. So the first thing that we have here is our URL. So this is where we're making our request. This is the URL of where we're trying to get data from. And then we set up this try catch block. And a try catch block is pretty much always used when we're doing a fetch request. And the reason why is basically it helps us handle errors. Okay, so our try block is going to execute. And if there is any error that is thrown, right, we have an error that's thrown, and it could be directly from the API itself, or anything else that throws an error will be caught by this catch block, and then we can do something with it. Okay, so let's look at the try portion first. This is where the actual request is being made. So inside the try block, we're creating a variable called response, and we're setting it equal to an await of a fetch call to this URL. So if you recall, this is going to initially create a promise, and then we're waiting for that promise to be resolved, and then that response is going to store whatever response we get from the API. Then we're going to do this brief check where we check this if statement. If response is not okay, that's what the exclamation point means at the front here. It's a not operator. So it's saying like, if the response is not okay, throw a new error that there, of this response status. So a lot of times, if a fetch request fails, the error will just be caught. But sometimes the server will actually respond with like a 404 error or something like that. And we want to handle that appropriately because we want a 200 response, right? Then after that, we have a response, but then like I mentioned up here, we have different options of how we can view that response. We can view it as JSON or just a string. And we want JSON because we're working in JavaScript. We want that JavaScript object notation. So we can set up this other line here, const JSON. So we're setting up a variable equal to response.json. So we're actually basically retrieving the JSON from the response, and we have to await that as well. And then on the last line here, they're just console logging the JSON. We're actually going to use it in our program, but that's a great way to see what we get as a response is to console log it. And then of course, in the catch block, they just have console error with the error message. So if there is an error, we'll see that in the console. Okay. So we declare a string containing the URL and then call fetch, passing the URL with no extra options. So we see that here, there's no extra options. We can add additional options, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. The fetch function will reject the promise on some errors, but not if the server responds with an error status like 404, right? Like not found. So we also check the response status and throw an error if it's not okay. And that's this portion right here. Otherwise, we fetch the response body content as JSON by calling the JSON method on response and log one of its values. Okay. Note that like fetch itself, JSON is asynchronous, as are all of the other methods to access response body content. So we do have to put that await keyword here and wait for it. Otherwise, we're going to run into issues. Okay. So pretty simple what we're going to do today. We're going to set up this fetch, and then we're going to use some JavaScript to just input the data that we get into the correct places on our Pokemon card. Now, I mentioned before there's other ways that we can do a fetch where we have a body that has other things in it. And so if you're familiar with using APIs, there's more than just GET requests. There's other types of requests. You may have heard of the term CRUD. There's other like GET, POST, patch, delete requests that correspond to those CRUD operations. Okay. And so in order to do any of those types of requests, we have to include some options or some settings with our fetch. So here you see sort of a different one where we're fetching against this URL, but then we also have this object in here, right? And inside the object, we have some options like a method. We can also put in there a body, right? So if we need to, let's say we're doing like a put or a patch request or we want to put some like data in the server. We need to actually include that data so we can use a body to do that and transfer some of that data. So we're not going to do any of that today. We're just getting information from the Poke API. So you don't need to worry about any of this stuff, but in the future, I would definitely recommend learning a little bit more about those types of requests. But for now, we're just going to do a simple GET request so you get comfortable using the fetch API. And to do that, we're just going to use the URL. So let's take a look at the API documentation. And this is something that you have to get very comfortable with because all RESTful APIs basically work in a different way. So unfortunately, whenever you're using an external API, you really have to learn how to read the docs and understand how to make these calls and what sort of data you're going to get back from different calls and what are your options, and if you need to include a body or anything like that, any specific options for your API calls. So if we look at the Poke API homepage here, obviously you can read all of the documentation, but they have a really great representation here of how we can actually make API requests, and we can even try it out here. So on the homepage, I recommend going to their website. It's just pokeapi.co, and you can try this out. This is the URL that we're going to make calls against, and they actually have different, different URLs that we can call against. We can get Pokemon. There's also other ones. We're going to use another one today for moves. So we need to get some Pokemon moves, right? Like their attacks and things like that. And so we were going to call separate ones. But for this example, we're just going to use Pokemon. And then what's really cool with this API is we can actually just use a numerical value after this. So we can type in like a Pokemon's name, like Pikachu, right? And then we'll get the information for Pikachu. Or we can type in a numerical value. So if I put in like 1, I'll get Bulbasaur. 2, I'll get Ivysaur, right? 25, I think, is Pikachu again. So we can use a numerical value instead. And I think this goes up to 1025. I don't think there's a 26th one. Yeah, so now we get resource not found. Okay, so we're going to use it in this way with this number because we don't really want to select a particular Pokemon. We just want to select a random number and then get a random Pokemon back. So basically all we're going to do is set up a fetch request like you saw before, right here. And instead of this URL, we're going to use this URL with Pokemon and then some random number strung on the end of it. Okay, so let's get into the coding. I don't want to talk too much about how APIs work. If you need more help with that, certainly you can reach out to us. We're happy to help you. Or just go onto MDN and read through the documentation here. This documentation on using the Fetch API is actually really, really excellent. So I recommend reading through everything that you see on this page. It'll be super helpful in understanding how to manage fetch requests in the future. Okay, so let's get right into it. In the last video, we worked on HTML and CSS. In today's video, we're going to work on the JavaScript. So you should have a popup.js. That's where we're going to store all of our JavaScript. And at this point, we are pretty much ready to start coding. However, we need to do one other thing, which is we need to connect our JavaScript to our HTML, right? Because as of right now, we have just been working on this HTML document. We connected our CSS, but our JavaScript is not connected yet. So the way that we do that is we use a script tag. And oddly enough, these are not self-closing tags, although we're not going to put anything in between them. We go into the first script tag body, and we're going to put the source in here, which is just going to be popup.js, because that's, in the main parent folder. So we don't need any, slash or anything like this, like not like this, right? It's not in any folder. It's just right here next to the HTML. And then the last thing that we need to do is add the attribute defer. And what this does is it prevents the JavaScript from loading until the entire HTML document has loaded. And this is important because if our JavaScript is going to be accessing any DOM nodes, any parts of our HTML document, which we are going to be using, then what's going to happen is if we load our JavaScript first up here before the rest of this loads, then we're going to run into errors because our JavaScript is going to be trying to access DOM elements that have not been added to the page yet, essentially. So this defer is going to prevent this JavaScript from running or from loading until all of this HTML has loaded. The other way that you will typically see this without the defer keyword is that developers will take this script tag and place it all the way at the bottom of their HTML, sort of like that. And that also works, right? Because all of this has to be loaded before we get here. However, I don't like this approach because this is not something that you commonly look for all the way at the bottom of an HTML document. To me, it makes more sense to have it up here in the head where you have links to your CSS and any other sort of metadata that you need for your page. So we're going to go with this option and we're going to put defer here. It's up to you what you'd like to do, but that's typically how I do that. So now we have our document connected, right? Our JavaScript connected to our HTML. So it should load. And let's just do a quick test we're going to do a console log of hello world just to check that our JavaScript is running. So now when I open this, right, we're going to see nothing because this console, this hello world is going to be logged to the console. And you might think, okay, I'm going to open this console and look over here. Okay, here's my console, and I open this up, and now we should have hello world here, but it's not printing. So why is this not happening? It's because this developer tool, this console, is for this page that I'm looking at here. And my Chrome extension sort of lives up here in the taskbar. So in order to access the console, what I have to do is I right-click and I inspect my Chrome extension, and then I'm going to get this separate window that opens up with my dev tools, and I go to the console here, and there you go. We have our hello world. Awesome. So now we have connected our JavaScript to our HTML. Okay. So the next thing that we need to do is sort of talk through a little bit of the logic of what we're going to do here. Okay. So if we start looking at our Chrome extension, we have a bunch of pieces of data that we want to update. Okay, so we have the Pokemon name, we have the HP, we have our 2 attacks with a title and description and an accuracy level for each of them. And then we have some other abilities like our attack, defense, and speed ability that we can update here, at least the numbers. We don't have to update any of the text, right? Because that's going to stay consistent. And so what we need to do is start by really just figuring out what ID we're going to use, right? So we need to set up some variables that we're going to use in our JavaScript. And the first one that we're going to do is ID, right? Because we have this ID that we're going to use as the identifier for which Pokemon we're going to call, right? So here I can put 1. In fact, I don't think I can put 0, so I'm not going to start with that one. Yeah, so I'm going to put 1 here. Okay, and so we should get Bulbasaur. So we're going to start by creating this variable. And then the next thing that we need to do is let's actually just start by setting up our fetch Pokemon function where we're going to actually do our fetch request. And that way we can start to see how all of this data will be used. And we're going to add on to this as we go. So the first thing I'm going to do is just make a comment for fetch Pokemon. Right, this is what our function's going to do. I'm going to call this function. I'm going to use a const and then set up the function fetch Pokemon. That's what I'm going to call this function. And I'm going to set it equal to an arrow function. And so inside of here, we can actually look back at our fetch API. I'm going to go up to the top where we had that sample. Okay, and we can basically do what we have here. So I'll do const URL equals. And for this, I'm going to use backticks. And the reason why is in a minute, we're going to dynamically update this. Well, actually, right now, we're going to dynamically update this URL or place the number in here. And then in a second, we'll actually dynamically update it. So you'll see what I'm saying in a second. So let's just copy the URL that we need. So it's going to be this portion here. Okay, and then also we want the Pokemon, so we're going to do /Pokemon. And then the last part, we have to enter our ID, which is up here. And we're going to use string interpolation to do that. So we're going to do a $sign and our curly braces, and then we can put the ID variable in there. So now this is going to pull this ID from here and use that as the URL. Okay, and then if we go back, the next thing that we need to do is set up a try catch block. So try. And then we're going to do catch, and this takes in the error. Okay. And for now, I'm just going to set up the catch as alert and error.message. Probably should use an M there, message. Okay. And so what's going to happen here is this alert is just going to pop up like a little popover that just shows the alert. That's probably not the best way to error handle, but for now, while we're in development, it's fine. Okay. The next thing that we're going to do is set up our try block. Okay. So here they're just console logging the error. Here I'm just alerting it. So it's a little different, but all works the same. So let's set up our try block. So we have const response equals wait fetch, and we're going to use our URL, right? We're going to use this URL. And if you notice, I'm getting a red line here when I use await, and that's because I have not made this function asynchronous. So to do so, I'm going to put an async right before our parentheses, and now we are all gravy. Cool. So we have our response, and then we have to do our check. So if not response.ok, we're going to throw a new error, and we're just going to say, we can just do like, I guess response status is, let's just do what they have here. So they use backticks and they say response status, and then response.status. Okay, so this is going to throw a new error that shows the response status, and that error will be caught here, and then it will be displayed. Okay, so we are good there. So we're now checking if our response is okay. If we pass this part, then now we have to get the JSON from our response. So we're going to do const JSON. In fact, I'm going to change this. So I'm going to call this Pokemon for now, equals await. Again, we have to await this, and then response.json. Okay, and then I'm going to console log, and I'm going to write Pokemon so that we can just see what it is and put in our Pokemon. Okay, so at this point, we have pretty much set up a fetch request for whatever ID we have listed here. And now let's check that it works. So in order to do so, we're going to open our Chrome extension, and then we're going to right click and inspect again, because again, we have to check the console here. And what's the error that we're having? Because we're not getting any response here, right? You would expect, okay, we should be getting something console logging it. The issue is that we've set up a function, but we have not called it yet. So below this, I'm going to do fetch Pokemon, and with our parentheses. And now, if we reload the Chrome extension, we should get a response in here. So I go to console, and there we go. We have Pokemon with our object, and there it is. We have successfully done a fetch request against this URL. And now we have a bunch of information about our Pokemon. We have like our name, abilities, cries, forms, game, and there's really a lot of information that we can get from this Pokemon API. And for today's video, we're only going to use a very small portion of it. However, if you're interested after this, I would highly recommend adding to this. Make it your own, and you can use some more of this information. I mean, you could really make a full Pokemon game out of this if you wanted to. There's just so much you can, so much data you can get from this. But in this video, we're really just going to use the name. We're going to use the, I think, abilities maybe. I don't think we're actually going to use these abilities. We have other ones that we're going to use. We're going to use some of the moves. So we're going to choose a couple random moves. And then we're going to use the sprites. So a sprite is basically a small pixelated image. Typically, we use the term sprite for like video games, but in this case, we're going to pull this information. So if you want to see what it is, I'm going to use this one, and I can just put this URL in a window, and it'll show me. There you go. There's our tiny little Bulbasaur sprite, right? So we're going to use that in our project. Okay. So we have a lot of information here, and let's basically get into it. So one of the things that we need to do here is, now we have this Pokemon, but one of the issues is that this Pokemon variable here, it only exists inside of this fetch block, right? It's block scoped. Anytime that we have curly braces and we declare a variable inside of this, it means we can only use it inside of this function, right? For example, or inside of this block, I should say. It's not always a function. So for example, like this URL, we won't be able to access this URL outside of the fetch Pokemon function because it's defined inside of here. And that's fine for the URL, but for the Pokemon, we actually need to use that data elsewhere, right? We don't want to just console log it. So what I'm going to do is actually set up a new variable all the way at the top here. So this is globally scoped, and I'm going to call it current Pokemon. Okay. And I don't need to set it equal to anything for now. I mean, I could set it equal to like it is going to be an object. So I might as well just set it equal to an empty object. And then here where we've defined Pokemon, I'm just going to, instead of defining a new variable, I'm just going to set the current Pokemon equal to our response. And then here I'm going to obviously do that as well. And now what we've done is we've globally scoped this information. So now we can use it in other functions. Okay, so pretty cool. We have that running. The only issue that I see now is, let me close this so it just looks a little better. So the only issue that I see now is that every time that we open this and do, a fetch, we're always going to get our Bulbasaur, and that's because the ID has not changed. So the next thing that we are going to do is actually build a function to shuffle this ID. And I'm going to actually put that above this. One of the cool features of VS Code is if you hover to the left of your code, you can see these little down carrots. And if you click the one that's at the start of a function, it'll collapse the function so that you have just a little bit clearer screen. So I'm going to do that for now. We might open that up again, but for now, I'm just closing that so you can see what I'm going to code a little bit more. So now I'm going to create a new function, and it's going to be I'm going to call it shuffle ID. But we're going to just add a comment that's just tells other developers what we're doing here. So I'm going to call this shuffle ID and set it equal to a arrow function. Okay. So we're setting up a new function here. And what I want to do is create a new variable, right? A new number. Okay. So I'm going to do new ID. Const new ID equals, and then I need to get a random number, and it needs to be between 1 and 1,000. Okay, because as we mentioned before, there's really only like 1,000 of these. There's really 1,025, so we can do that, but 1,000 is just a nice round number, so we'll do that. So in order to do that, we can use the math.random method, and we multiply that by 1,000. And then the other thing that we need to do is, this is going to give us a float. So we need to do math.floor. And this will round down to the lowest number. And then the last thing here is, because this is a string and we're using it as a string here, I'm just going to convert this to a string by typing string and wrapping everything in this string. Okay. So to recap, we basically are choosing a random number between 0 and 1,000, getting, the integer value of that, and then converting that to a string. Okay. And then the last thing we're going to do is set our ID equal to this new ID. So we're going to do ID equals new ID. So this will basically take whatever this new ID is and put it into the value of ID. And we can just check that it worked by console logging that. And we'll just do ID and ID. Pretty cool. Very simple, just shuffle function. So now what we're going to do is again, we have created a function, but we're not calling it anywhere yet. So what I want to do is actually call that up here, and I need to do it above this URL, right? Because we want to shuffle that before we set the URL. Otherwise, it's going to be the previous one that we set. Okay, so I'm just going to do shuffle ID like so. So now we can check again. If I inspect, it should be not Bulbasaur unless we were random. Yeah, so now we have ID is 15. And then we can check. We see the ID is 15 and we get Beedrill. Cool. So now we are shuffling, and just to check that it's working on each one, we can inspect again. And now we have 155 and a different one. Okay. So pretty cool. We're making progress here. So now we're getting a random Pokemon. The next thing that we need to do is we're going to need to start inputting some of the data that we have. Now, you may have noticed that we get a bunch of data, but we'll see as we go through this that we don't actually get all of the information for the moves that we're going to add here. And we're going to walk through how to do that as we get there. But the next thing that I want to do is I want to set up a function to start setting the information on this card, right? So right now we're collecting all this information from the API, but it's not adding anything to the card. Okay, so that's what we're going to do in the next one. So again, I'm going to collapse these just so it's easier to see. Okay, I'm going to set up a new function. I'm going to call this set Pokemon. And it's going to set a new, set the new Pokemon details. Okay, const set Pokemon equals, and again, an arrow function. Okay. And yeah, so now how are we going to do this? So at this point, hopefully you have learned a little bit about the document object model. And basically, I'm going to give you a brief understanding of what that means. So in an HTML document in an HTML document, we have this representation called the document object model. So it's basically a JSON object that we can access every DOM node. So every basically HTML tag can be identified, and we can access attributes of that. We can access basically all sorts of stuff with a DOM node. So any tag itself, we can select, and then we can update information. We can do all sorts of stuff with it. There's a lot you can really do with the DOM. So feel free to look into that more. But in today's video, all we're going to do for the most part is update some of the text content, right? So we have like, this title, for example, or this Pokemon name in this H1. So we're going to identify this DOM node, and then we're going to update the inner text content. Okay, so here's how we're going to do that. We're going to start basic and then add to it as we go. So the first thing that I want to do is create a variable that holds the DOM node itself, and then we can do things to that. So for example, let's look at our Pokemon card. We have this Pokemon name and the HP and like image, right? So those are the first three that we're going to do. Okay. So let's start with the first one, just the name. So I'm going to do const name equals, and then I need to identify this tag here, or this HTML element. And so if I look at that, I have an ID here called name. And so I can identify it using that. And so we do that by first starting at the document level, and then we can use this get element by ID method, and we feed it the ID that we're looking for, which is name. Okay. So now what I've done here is I created a new variable called name, which just stores this DOM node in it. And then from there, what I can do is I can update that. So what I'm going to do is name.text content. So that's going to take the text content and then set it equal to something else. Okay. And in this case, it's going to be, if we inspect here, we're going to set it equal to, remember, this is our current Pokemon object that I'm looking at here. And so I can really access it just by doing current Pokemon and using dot notation to access the name. Okay. So dot notation allows us to access the values based on any key inside of an object. So I'm going to do current Pokemon, and I'm going to use question mark period here. And this question mark is just going to make sure that we don't have an error in our code if that doesn't exist. If that doesn't exist, it's just going to be undefined instead of actually breaking the application. Okay, so here we go. So text content equals current Pokemon dot name. There we go. And now if I close and reopen this, why am I not getting the name? Well, it's because, again, I'm not calling this function, right? So we have to call this function. And so inside our fetch Pokemon, once we have actually done the call and received the information, now I can actually set the Pokemon. Okay, so I can call that inside of there and set our Pokemon. So now if I close and open, there we go. Now we have changed the name, and this should update on each one as it is. Perfect. Awesome. So now we're just going to basically repeat this process for the rest of the card. So I'll go a little bit quicker here, but I'll still explain. So I'm going to do the HP next. Okay, so const HP equals document dot get element by ID. And this one I already know is called HP. You can check your HTML, but I remember that one. So it's HP. Okay. And then again, we're going to do hp.textContent equals. Now, here's the interesting thing. Our HP tag has this 40 HP in here. And if we look at the response that we get, let's just take a quick look here. So we have, I believe it is in stats. Okay, so in our stats, we have stats. This first one is HP. So there's other stats here, and we're going to use these other ones for the bottom, like the attack, defense. But our HP is here, and the value is 50 for this particular Pokemon. So what you notice, though, is that the value is 50, and it doesn't say 50 HP. So what we need to do is create a new string, and I'm going to use a template literal like we did before. And so inside of here, I'm going to have, I need to pull out this number right here. So in order to do that, I'm going to use our current Pokemon question period. And then this is stats at 0 base stat. So stats at 0, oops. So we're going to use square brackets at 0 question dot base underscore stat. And that should give us the number. Okay, so we can check. So now we have the number, but we're missing the HP, so we can put that after the curly brace here. And now we should have both. There we go. We have 100 HP, 75. Awesome, we're getting there. So now we have the top done. And the next thing we need is our image. Okay, so just like the first two, we're going to do const image equals document dot get element by ID. And this one is also called image. If you want, you can check that. Here we go. ID is image. Right? But this time, we're not updating the text content, right? Because the image is not going to have some text content. What we do need to update is the source, right? So what we're going to do is use a little bit different method here. So instead of text content, we're going to do image dot, and we're going to set an attribute. So there's a method we can use called set attribute, and it takes two things. It takes, the first thing is which attribute. So it's a string value of an attribute, and then comma separated after that is going to be the value that we want to replace that with. So we're going to do dot src is going to be the attribute we want to change. And our value, if we check, is going to be, so remember, this is the image. So we're going to look at our current Pokemon, and the image is going to be under sprites like we checked before. And then we're going to use this front default. If you notice, some of these are null, but there's always going to be a front default. So we're going to use that one. So again, current Pokemon question dot, and it's under sprites question dot front underscore default. Okay, so now, there you go. Now we're getting an image there. Pretty sweet. All right, so the last thing that I want to do before we get into the next section is these bottom ones here, because we have this data already, and we might as well build that out. So I'm going to call these the abilities. We've used that term sort of in our HTML. So I'm going to set up a new sort of block here where we're going to get these abilities. So I'm going to call these ability 1 underscore value, ability 2 underscore value, because we really just want the value. We don't need the name portion of that. That's hard coded and it's not going to change. It's always going to be attack, defense, and speed, but these values are going to change. So I'm going to use those terms for the DOM node identifier. So ability 1 underscore value, and that's going to be equal to document dot get element by ID. At this point, you should understand sort of where we're going with this. And if I look at my HTML, so remember it's this one, so it's going to be ability underscore value, just like the name that we use there. Okay, and for the other two, I can just copy and paste this. I don't need to rewrite the whole thing, but I do need to change these values to 2 and 3. Okay, so now we have our 3 ability values here. Our DOM nodes are set to these variables. And what we need to do is change those to we need to change the actual numerical values of those abilities. So I'm going to inspect again and just take a look at our objects so that we can find where those are. They're under stats. And we're going to use, I think 1 is attack, 2 is defense, and 5 is our speed. So I'm going to start changing those. So ability 1 value text content is going to be equal to our current Pokemon question dot stats. And it's going to be the stat. This one is going to be 1 because we want that attack value. And then we want the base underscore stat. Okay, so if we check our Pokemon again, if we reload, now it's updating every time that we click. So it's changing for that particular Pokemon. So now we need to do the other two. We can again just copy and paste this and change these values, right? We want to change that to 2, this to 3. And then if we recall, this defense was 2 and this one was 5. And so now if we update, now we should get new ones on every update. Pretty sweet. So good job so far. We have most of everything completed. The last section that we need to do is the moves. Okay, so right now we have that hard-coded, but we actually want to update those dynamically with everyone. So what I'm going to do is the moves are a little bit interesting because if we inspect this now, what we can see is there's actually quite a few moves to choose from. Okay, in this case, each Pokemon is different. In this case, there's 121, which is quite a bit. Right, let me choose another one that's a little bit simpler so that we can see. So we have moves, and it's this array of objects, okay? And there's a lot of them, and we only need 2. And this is kind of cool because we can select 2 randomly out of here, and that will create a really customized card every time that we generate it. They'll never be the same. Or not very likely that they'll be the same. So inside our moves object, we also have 2 pieces of information. We have the name and a URL. Now, inside of our Pokemon card, we have a name, I believe this is like the accuracy, and then the description. Okay, but we're not actually getting all of that data currently. And the reason why is the API is set up so that you need to do a second API call to get the accuracy and the description from the move. And the way that you do that is by calling against this URL right here. So if you notice, it's the same API we're calling, but instead of the Pokemon like we have here, we have move. And then it has like a number associated with it. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up a new function now, which collects all of this data so that we can store it and then input it in our card, because it's sort of all over the place, right? We have the name here, and then the rest of the information is behind another API that we have to call. So we're going to organize that a little bit. So for now, we're going to pause on our set Pokemon function, because we're going to add more to that so that we set those values for the actual moves. But the first thing that we need to do is actually get 2 random moves and collect all the information for it so that we can store it somewhere so that we can use it a little bit more easily. So I'm going to set up a new function. I'm going to just say select 2 random moves and collect details. Okay. And I'm going to do const get moves equals, again, an arrow function. You could set these up as a regular function, just so you know. Arrow function, I just prefer that. So, and then the first thing that we want to do is get the total number of moves here, right? So pretty basic. All we have to do is get the length of this array, and we should have the number of different moves there are. Okay, and that's going to help us choose a random one. So we're going to set up a variable called const total moves equals current Pokemon question dot moves, right? Here's our moves question dot length. Okay, so this should now be basically the value we have here, 56. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is, this may seem like sort of complicated to you, but you'll understand it as we sort of get through everything. So the first thing that I want to do is set up 2 objects to store moves information. Okay, and this is just going to make it easier for us. So in the future, when we need to access this data. So I'm going to do let move1 equal this object. And the object is going to have a few parts, right? We need the name, the description, the accuracy, and also we're going to store this URL where we actually do the call, because we're going to use that in a second. So name, accuracy, which I'm just going to set to null because this should be a numerical value, description, which is going to be an empty string. Remember, we're just setting these up, so we're not inputting any values right now. And then the URL, okay? And I'm going to copy this and paste it. Okay, so now we have 2 moves that we can work with here. Okay, these values are scoped inside of this function, so they're not going to be accessible anywhere else, but we're going to use them throughout this function to actually store some of the data. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to get 2 random moves. Okay, and then we're going to store them, those random moves, in these objects that we just created. So I'm going to say select 2 random moves from moves list. And so I'm going to do const random move1 equals, and then we need to select one randomly from this list. And so we could set up, we could abstract this away a little bit, but I'm just going to make it very simple so that we can see exactly what's going on. So we're going to do current Pokemon. Remember, that's our current Pokemon object. And we want the moves, right? So we have these. And then we need to select a random move out of here. So I'm going to use square brackets to select a random one here. And again, we're going to do basically what we did up here, where we shuffled the ID. So it's in here, right? So we're going to use basically this, but instead of 1,000, we're going to put in our total number of moves. Okay. So I'm just going to write that out again so you can see it. So it's going to be math.floor and then math.random multiplied by total moves, right? Our variable here. And we want to do -1 because our total moves is the entire length, but remember, this is 0 index. So yeah. Okay, so we have one of them, right? So there's a random move number 1, and we need a second one. So we have random move number 2. Okay, so we can just duplicate that. And then we need to set some of this data that we get. Remember, we get some information from this. We get the name and the URL. So we're going to set that in the objects that we just created. And to do that, let's actually comment. So it's set move names and URLs. Okay, so to do that, I'm going to use something called dot notation. Or I'm sorry, not dot notation, the spread operator. And I'll show you how that works in a second. So basically, I'm going to we already declared our move. And so now I'm going to set it equal to this sort of new object. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this 3 dots. This is called spread syntax. So it's going to, you can spread any iterable object like an array or an object. We can spread out the values in them. into here. So basically I'm going to do spread the 3 dots and move 1. So it's going to take basically everything that's inside of here, and it's sort of like it's just copying and almost like pasting it in here. It's basically what that spread operator does. But there's one really cool feature of it is that if now I include a new key value pair that matches any of the key names here, it will override what's being applied there. So for example, if I want to, I can take, what we're going to do here is I'm taking this move 1, I'm setting it to a new object, spreading out the values that are currently in it. So it's sort of like I'm pasting those values in here, but then I'm going to create, I'm going to change the name, right? Because we have the name already from here in our random move, right? So like, for example, absorb, right? If I set a new name, it will override the one that I spread into here. Okay, so how do I get that name? So we have our random move 1. Remember, this is move 1. And it's, if I look at, any of these, it's in the move and then it's called name. So I just do random move 1 question.move question.name. Okay, so this will reset the value of name in move 1 and keep everything else. Okay, there's another thing that we also have in here, which is the URL. Okay, so I can input that as well, URL, and that's going to be very similar. Random move 1 move URL. Okay, so basically this is just reset the name and the URL in this object here. I'm going to do the same thing for the second move. So move 2, just make sure I change all these values appropriately, 2 and 2. So now I have basically reset the name and the URL for both of those. Now, right, so we have the name and the URL, but we're missing the description and the accuracy level. So we need to get those values. So what we need to do is, again, another fetch, okay? So I'm going to set up a try catch block like we did before because we're doing a fetch request. And in our catch, I'm just going to do, again, our alert error.message. And what I'm also going to do here is if we do get an error, so one thing that I can do, there's some options here, but I just want to show you. So an alert is going to pop up like a little popover that shows the alert, the error message. And that's great so that we can see it while we're developing. But one of the functionalities that we want is if there is some sort of error, we do sort of want to just call again, potentially, right? Because depending upon what the error is, I guess, but we do want to call this again so that we get a new Pokemon. So what we can actually do is do our fetch Pokemon function here as well. So when we close that alert window, it's just going to fetch again. Okay, so it'll get a new one. So we can add that there. And then inside of our try block, here's where we have to call on that new URL. Okay, so let's just get into it, I guess. So const, we have to designate the 2 different responses that we get from the fetch API. So let's call them something different. So move 1 response equals, and we're going to use await fetch. And this time we can use the URL directly from this object. So I can do move 1 question.url. Okay. And if you notice here, I'm getting an issue where I have await underlined again. And the reason why is that our function up here is not asynchronous. So I need to add the async keyword. And now we are good again. Okay. And then we need to call the second one. Right. So we have move 2 response. Okay. And if you recall, we had this statement up here, this if response okay, right? So if we get a bad response from that, so we need to check both of these. But if you notice, now we have an issue because response is not correct. We need to do move 1 response. And then we can change this to move one response dot status. And that's checking the first one. So we need to check the second one as well. There we go. So we have our checks to make sure that the response is okay. And of course, if they are okay, then we need to get the JSON, right? So we're going to basically do what we did before. This should be pretty easy to you at this point. I mean, we've done it once already. So I'm going to do variable const move one, and I'll call it move one data. These variable names don't matter too much. You just want to have something that explains what's going on here. So move one response dot JSON. So we're getting the JSON. And again, I will copy that and paste it. Save us some time. Okay, so now we should have the data for those. And let's just do a quick console log of both of those. Move one data. So I didn't put any identifier in there just because I want to do this quickly. But now if we inspect, we should see, so what's happening here? Again, we're not actually calling this function. So where should we call this function? I think is a good question, right? So we're going to get the move. So first of all, we're getting the Pokemon, and then we're setting the Pokemon, but we actually want to get the moves before we set the Pokemon because we need to get all that information. So I'm going to put get moves here. And one important thing is that this takes some time, right? There's a fetch request in here. So we actually need to await this because we don't want to just get moves and then immediately go to set Pokemon. Because there's an API call happening inside of this function. So we need to await that as well. So let's reload and inspect. And now we should have this move one and move two object. Okay, so this is the move one data and the move two data that I just opened up here. So we see like the name, acid spray, the accuracy, which we're going to use. And then the last thing that we're going to use is what they call the flavor text entries. And this is a pretty interesting one. So if you notice, these are text entries that are basically the description that we're going to use. But if you notice, they're in a bunch of different languages. But what is cool is that inside this object, it actually shows what language it is. So we're going to filter for English because we speak English. Okay, so let's do that part here. So we have our data. Okay, I'm going to keep it console logged. And then we need to set our description and accuracy in these move objects that we have. So I'm just going to do that. Move one equals, and again, we're going to use our spread syntax, move one. And now we just need to change the description to something, right? I'm just going to hold this here. And then the other thing is we need to change our accuracy to something, some value as well. Okay, so what is the value? So let's do the accuracy first because that one's easier. It's really just move one data dot accuracy. So I can put that in here. Move one data question dot accuracy. Okay, so now we set the accuracy. Now this one's a little bit more difficult. So for the description, again, just to reiterate, we need to find one of these in here that has EN as the name for the language, right? We only need one of these flavor texts. There's a bunch of them. And it's kind of funny, like some of them don't make any sense because they're user inputted. This is an open source API where users contribute. So what we need to do is find really the first one that has EN, right, for English. Okay, so how are we going to do that? It's actually not as hard as it seems. We're going to use some JavaScript functionality. So the first thing that I need to do is get this flavor text entries. So if I do move one data question dot flavor flavor underscore text underscore entries, right? So now I have like this whole array of them, but I need to find something. So I can use the find API or the find method. And if you're curious about how it works, just go to MDN and you can read all about it, how it works here. You can find all of this information here, but I'm just going to use it and you'll follow along with me. So we're going to do let's do question.find. And this find method takes a callback function that is going to determine like what we're trying to find. So we're going to try to find an entry. So basically what it's going to do is go through all of them. This entry is going to be each individual value in there. Okay. And then what we need to do is find an entry where the language is EN. Okay. So let me just show you, for example, I'm going to comment this for a second just so I can get that object back so we can see it. Okay. So recall we are here, flavor text entries. We have this entire array here and we're finding. So entry is going to be one of the entries in here. And we need to find an entry where language name equals English. Okay. So we have entry. So we want entry dot language, right? Dot language dot name triple equals EN. Okay. So then we're basically finding the first value, the first entry, right? The first entry in this array where the language is English. Okay. And then the last thing is, that's going to give us like the whole entry, but we really just want the flavor text, right? We actually just want the text. So I'm going to string onto this behind the closing parentheses there, flavor underscore text. Okay. So that should give us the actual text. Now all we need to do is copy this for move 2. Cool. That looks good to me. So the last thing is I'm going to just copy these and paste them and remove data because I want to console log this move 1 and move 2. And I'll just do just so that we can see like what this information is, because I don't want to do console logs without knowing what I'm logging. Okay, so now we basically have gotten moves. We have all this data. We've changed the name, the URL, and now we've changed the description and the accuracy. So we should have all of this data. So I just want to check that that's correct. So I'll reload, go to inspect, console, move 1, and there we go. We have all of our information there. And let's check. We have it all here as well. Awesome. So if you guys are here, great job. The next thing that we need to do is get this information onto our card somehow. Okay, so how are we going to do that? I think the easiest way is to set up a global variable, because if you remember, everything that we've done so far is inside of this get moves function. So it's block scoped inside of there. So we're not going to be able to access move 1 or move 2 anywhere else because we declared them inside of here. But what we can do is set up another global variable, and we'll just call it, let's go with like current Pokemon attacks, current Pokemon attacks. And we'll set this equal to an empty array. And this array, we're going to store our move 1 and our move 2. Okay, so what I can do is go back into get moves, go all the way to the bottom once we've gotten our moves, and I can do current Pokemon attacks equals move 1, move 2. Okay, so I'm just taking the values there and putting them into an array that's globally scoped. So now we can use that in our other functions. Cool. I think we are pretty much done with that portion, right? Getting our moves, but now we actually need to set that information, right? So we still haven't changed anything on the card, but this is really our last step until we've completed it. So let's just get right into it. So we have a bunch of variables some DOM nodes that we need to access. So I'm just going to go right into them. So just to make this simpler, I'm going to put them sort of where they appear on the card. So I have like name, HP, image up here, and then the abilities are at the bottom. So I'm going to put them right in between. And we need to start identifying a bunch of these DOM nodes, right? We have the title, the description, and the accuracy times 2, essentially. So if I look at this, I already have IDs set up for them, right? Attack title, attack accuracy, attack DESC for description. So I'm going to use like those same values just to keep it consistent. You don't have to. You can name them something else if you wanted to. Okay, so attack. Let me turn off caps lock. Attack 1. It was called title equals document dot get element by ID. And it's going to be called attack 1 title. And then we also need the description. All right, so we need to duplicate that actually first. And there we go. And then I can reuse this for DESC. DESC. And copy, paste that. Remove that line. Okay. And then the last thing that we need is our accuracy. I'm going to copy, paste, and 2. All right, cool. So we have our title, description, accuracy. Okay. And now we need to just set them. And I'm going to do the same thing as before, where I'm going to put them sort of where they go in terms of like spatially on the card, right? So again, that's a cool one. We have all our information, but nothing's been set yet. So that's what we're going to do now. So let's start with the title. So we have attack 1 underscore title dot text content equals. And for this, it's going to be, remember, we have this global object called current Pokemon attacks. And this is going to be the first one. So this will be at index 0. And it's called name. Right? If we recall from our get moves, we called this name. Okay, that's the title. Cool. I don't know why that changed there. We don't want random move. We want name. There we go. Cool. And I can do this for the second one as well. So attack 2 title, text content, and that's 1. So let's take a look at that really quick. Cool. So now we have the names in there, but I do see one issue here, and that is that we have this dash in between here. So how do we remove this programmatically? It's actually quite simple with JavaScript. There's 2 methods that we can use. They're string methods. One is split and one is join. So split will split a string into an array of strings on a particular character. And then join will combine an array of strings on a particular character. So how we do that is like this. So we can string these methods onto what we have here. So I'm going to do dot split. And there's parentheses, and then inside of here, we put a string which designates what we want to separate them on. So that's going to be our dash, right? And then we need to join them back with a space. Okay, so we're essentially just taking this dash and replacing it with a space. And so just to show you the difference, so we may have to do this a couple times so you see it, but I have this set on the first one, but not the second. So if I reload, now you can see here we remove that dash, and on this one it's still there. So we're going to just copy and paste what we just did and add that to the other name. And now both should work properly, right? If I need to find, there you go. So we have two that should have a dash, but now they have spaces. You also may notice if I look at our console really quick and look at, for example, here, Stomping Tantrum is the name, right? But you notice it's not capitalized here. The reason it's capitalized here is because of our CSS, right? We did text transform to capitalize that. And we handled that in the last video, so it makes it easy on us now. Cool. All right, let's move on to the last two parts, which are the accuracy and the description. And these should be pretty straightforward as well. If you're up to this point, you should really understand how to do this with no problem. So I'm going to do attack1 accuracy dot text content equals, and pretty simple, right? We have current Pokemon attacks at 0 question dot accuracy. And we're going to do the same for 2. Change that to 1. So now we can check. Yep, now those are updating. However, I do see they're always the same. So maybe we made a mistake down here. Did we not change the accuracy? Yep. So we see move 1 data. So we need this to be move 2 data. There you go. Yeah, so there's 2 separate ones. Cool. Okay. And then the last thing we need is just the description. So that should be pretty easy. Let's find where that is. So here, I'm just going to like copy and paste this one because it's going to be pretty much the same. The only thing we're going to change is accuracy to DESC and this accuracy as well. What did I label that? Let's see. Description, the full word description. Cool. So now, there we go. Now we have our description, and it looks like we made the same mistake with the description as we did. So, yep. So here we need this to be 2. I guess we just copied that without changing anything. So now we have everything. And there you go. I mean, you guys did a great job. This looks really kick-ass. Proud of you guys for pushing through that. It can be a little bit confusing to work with APIs, but we have done it. We have a cool little Pokemon Chrome extension. So congratulations. Great job on this. You have completed everything for this Chrome extension. In the next video, I'm going to create a little bonus video to talk about some of the other things that we can do with this and ways that we can improve our code. But this is a great example of using the basics of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to do something a little bit different. And we even threw in an API, which is really cool. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. If you found that valuable, let us know. Let us know if you like more videos like this. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, share what you've done inside the group, anything that you've changed with the application. We'd love to see what you guys have done and how creative you have been. So with that, thank you for tuning in. I will create another video just for some bonus content, but you guys did great. If you got here, you should have a pretty good understanding of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript at this point. With that, thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you on the next video.